Krebs. I'm with the music department here at Hendrix, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's presentation on behalf of Hendrix College and the Hendrix Murphy Foundation. Before we get to the presentation itself, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. The Hendrix Murphy Foundation is always interested in being the best possible steward of its resources that it can be, and with that in mind, please note that there are assessment cards in your program, and I encourage you to fill one of those out and leave it in the receptacle on the way out. The other announcement is that after the presentation, there will be a reception and book signing, and you can speak with Kate Gale, and I invite you to stay for a few minutes afterwards. Now to the main event. Our speaker tonight, Kate Gale, has had a multifaceted career in literature. She's a teacher with extensive experience in teaching creative writing. She is the managing editor of Red Hen Press, a significant independent press. And she is an accomplished and published writer and poet. And she has made a special mark in the mysterious and murky world of the opera libretto, something that not many poets can claim. And so with that, please welcome Kate Gale.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you very much for having me. Is the mic okay? Yes? I thought I would start. How are we doing? Better? Okay. I thought I would start with reading a short, two duets from The Inner Circle, which is an opera that opera libretto that I wrote based on T.C. Boyle's The Inner Circle, which is about Dr. Kinsey, the famous sex researcher. And the first duet, they're both by the same two people. John is a member of The Inner Circle, and Kinsey had everyone in The Inner Circle basically trading partners. And so John comes home one night and finds that his wife has been shared with one of the other partners, and she now would like to leave him. And so this is that conversation. The reference to the H scale is, of course, Kinsey had this famous H scale that was how gay people were, that he believed everybody was on an H scale. And the second duet is the end of the opera. And at this point, Kinsey wants to sleep with Iris himself, and because of that, she left her husband. And so he's going to see her. She's now moved back in with her mother, taking their child, and he's trying to get her to come back. So we'll start with this first one, when he first finds out that his wife has slept with another one of the sex researchers. Iris, I'm in love. John, he's a player. Iris, he makes me float on air. He's an operator. He's a musician, a conductor, a violinist. Not a conductor. Conductors focus. Who says they focus? They just wave their stick around, call themselves a virtuoso. That shows how little you know about anything. You don't go to the music evenings at Proc's. He's more like a tenor, a soprano, his voice going everywhere. Iris, I've always loved a good tenor. Maybe I have an H scale, too. We haven't been married a year. You'll always be my first love. This is better, bigger. I'm sure you understand. He's married. This is outside marriage. You should see him. I have seen him. He's a sex researcher. It's just research to him. I'm researching, too. I'm researching Purvis. Believe me, there's a lot to research. So the second duet is, again, at the very end, and he's trying to get her to come back. Iris, sweetheart. She's standing with the clarinet. He rushes forward and is on his knees in front of her, his arms wrapped around her legs. You know I can't live without you, and the baby. I need you. How much? Desperately. I never have to sleep with him, never. He doesn't own me, right. Neither do you, of course. The project doesn't own me, absolutely. I own me, completely, and you own me. You've learned so much as a sex researcher, John, but I may still have something to learn. Iris, her hand on his head, which is very near his waist. Oh yes, but I'll teach you, step by step, I'll teach you. She plays another triumphant Wagnerian note. Downstairs, Proc is lecturing Iris's mother. Sex research shows that in this brave new world, the female is triumphant. The female has always controlled sex, and now that she no longer needs the male's money, the female is primary. Females simply do not need males for survival anymore. If a female keeps a male around, it's simply that she likes him. She's tolerating him because he's behaving himself. She's probably training him. This training takes decades. So I liked working on that because there's so much energy. Obviously, once you have a sexual situation, which there's plenty of in the inner circle, you have tension between males and females. So I wanted to jump from that to talking a little bit about opera in general, and then I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience with it. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that opera started off as low art. And we think of it as almost the highest of art forms, like ballet, for a very small select group. But it was once something that Mozart's rowdy bunch was going to see. In much the same way that jazz was low art at one point. You know, jazz started off in New Orleans whorehouses. Somebody was banging upstairs and somebody was banging downstairs. And so when you think about what makes something make the shift, what makes an art form make a shift from low art to high art, I don't think there's a single trajectory, but I think what we tend to think is that when you make it to some particular kind of venue, that you've become high art. However, you know, so you have Duke Ellington playing Carnegie Hall. Does that make jazz high art? And I would argue that that is not necessarily the case. I was talking with the students about Bjork playing the Hollywood Bowl, and Coldplay, I notice, is playing Disney Hall in a few weeks. I don't think Coldplay is yet considered high art, but they have the money to rent Disney Hall. I think that what makes something high art is the space it inhabits in the cultural commons, and whether it comes to belong to a specialized group that are willing to write about it and teach it in universities. I think at the point that you can take classes on rap at Harvard, it will have reached some particular level. And so certainly opera is considered very high art, and in fact is in danger of being a museum piece, partly because it's so expensive. What makes opera different than musical theater is a couple things. I mean, the most significant, of course, is that if I were an opera singer singing here, I would not need a microphone. If I were an opera singer singing to 6,000 people, I wouldn't need a microphone. So that huge voice inhabits this massive space. The singer who was the mezzo in Rio was once at my house for a party, and everyone was urging her to sing, and she sang, and she broke one of the windows. So I think the moral of that is be careful about inviting sopranos to your house and allowing them to sing. The other big difference, of course, is that musical theater has investors and opera has philanthropists. So musical theater can be done over and over, partly because those voices are mic'd, so they're not being strained in the same way that opera singers are. And so you can invest and they can do, you know, Phantom of the Opera or Rent for many, many nights in a row, whereas opera is both difficult and expensive. And interestingly, as soon as film came out, and there are opera composers that would argue that film was kind of the death of opera, many composers who have been composing for opera decided to compose for film. Because, of course, the wonderful thing about being a film composer is that people will hear your music over and over. It inhabits the public consciousness in a particular way. We all know the music to Darth Vader's entrance, or even to Jaws or Twilight Zone. And you can, of course, make more money at it. It's strange that composers want to make money, but apparently they do, from a poet's point of view, of course. So that many of those composers in the early 50s started to compose music for film. I also think that about this whole idea of opera being special and being in danger of being a museum piece as being part of the kind of people that tend to go to opera. Even in LA, where people don't dress up for anything, people dress up to go to the opera. And so all of that lends itself to the idea that this is an event that has a particular kind of pomp and circumstance, so that if you are going to opera, you're a very special kind of person. Whereas, the Hollywood Bowl, for example, even when it's classical music night, almost anybody feels that they can go and understand Beethoven's Ninth, or even... Obviously, I need to not jump around too much here. Let me see if I'm doing this right. Is that okay? Yes? Okay. I always think of the movie Moonstruck, where Nicolas Cage is playing this, Italian baker, and he takes his girlfriend to the opera. And you just don't think of working class people ever going to the opera anymore. But there was a time when obviously people did. Part of the fact is that in New York, going to the Met is maybe $350 for the cheaper seats, and in LA it's $150. So that's out of many people's budgets. I think that what will eventually change about opera, and is starting to change, is that there will be more and more chamber opera, where you can do it less expensively, you can do it with 4 to 8 singers, and you see more of these on college campuses. The opera, The Inner Circle, that we worked on could be done with a big chorus, but it also could be done with 8 people. And I think that the more of that happens, the more operas will be done. Because if you look at most of the opera houses in the United States, most of them are doing what we call warhorse operas. So they're doing operas that were written hundreds of years ago, because they know they can count on an audience for Gianniscicchi and Duke Bluebeard and Otello and of course Carmen. So you do those over and over. In terms of opera houses that are really doing new opera, there's the Santa Fe, Houston, San Francisco, but not many others. So I hope that the trend will continue towards more chamber opera. And I don't think that opera is something that's going to go away, because I think there's always that sort of grand spectacle of entering this space where someone's singing with that kind of a huge, huge voice. And there's nothing quite like it. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between doing an adaptation and doing an original story, and I was talking with this a little bit the theater students today. When you're doing an adaptation, you're taking a longer book. So I wrote one based on The Inner Circle, and one based on Kindred, and one based on an Ursula Le Guin story that she and I worked on together. So you're taking this longer story and you're taking out the parts of it that are going to work as music and that are going to work theatrically. And you're leaving out all the long narrative stretches. You're leaving out any flashbacks. You're leaving out any conversations that are just sort of giving you a sense of either the character or the setting. Because what you need to be doing is moving the plot forward. And you're also working very hard to make it so that it's not very wordy. So you go through and basically harvest the story so that what you have is something that you feel is coherent enough that it tells the story, but that it is rushing along because you don't want the audience to lose interest for a moment. I think the idea that there are some operas that are, quote, written from scratch is simply not true. Because I think that most stories have been written. Rio de Sangre is in some ways, the main woman is very much like Lady Macbeth. The main bad guy is very much like Iago, and the main story is very much like something, there's pieces of the Pinochet story in it, and, the throwing people out of airplanes piece, and then there's certainly pieces of the main character story, which is very much like Eva Peron. She very much wants to control the country through her husband. So it's about the fall of a South American dictator, and then this other dictator takes over, and there's a nebulous North American country that gets somewhat involved, but is not completely helpful. Obviously, this is a very familiar story to any of you who have kept track of South American politics at all. So none of this is really creating a new story, but based on all those threads, this story is created. And so what happened was, the sketching out of the story happened in the beginning between the composer and myself, and then I dived in and started working on it piece by piece, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But what you're looking for when you're creating a story, whether it's an adaptation or not, is that sort of resonance that you're looking for in any art form. When you read something, when you look at a painting, when you hear a piece of music, that you feel that sense of enormous presence. And what that is, that resonance presence, is you are aware that this art form is about what it means to be human, and you are human, and so you feel that connection. And that's what you're looking for. I think that opera is something that you enter because it's this grand spectacle, and the music inhabits you, and that the story sort of carries you along. I want to say, while I'm on the subject of story, I think that in the United States, when I think of writers, I think that there are certain stories that carry us forward as to what it means to be a writer. The three rudders I always think of as a poet are Poe, Whitman, and Dickinson. And I think that Edgar Allan Poe is someone that people think of as sort of this model for what it is like to be a writer, and that they sort of aspire toward. And so writers will try to live sort of wild, crazy lives like Poe, or even like Hemingway, thinking that that's what's going to make them a real writer. Or there are writers that try to live these very quiet lives where they don't get out much, and they don't want to publicize their own book because they're just above all of that. So they think of themselves as being sort of more the Emily Dickinson model. And I think of both of those as being extremely unhealthy models in terms of what it means to be an artist or a writer. Poe married his 13-year-old first cousin. There are debates of whether she died of disease or starvation, but certainly he didn't take very good care of her, and he died in a pool of his own vomit. None of this seems like an attractive future. And so I think this is a very poor model for writers. Emily Dickinson, of course, wrote, I believe it's 1,386 wonderful poems that you can get the collected poems. And I'm a big Emily Dickinson fan. However, I also don't think she's a very good model as a writer. She missed something fairly important that happened during her lifetime that if I had been alive, I would have noticed. I definitely think I would have noticed the Civil War. But Emily kind of missed that. On the other hand, Walt Whitman, who was alive, he did not want to fight in the Civil War, but he worked as a nurse on the battlefield to the Civil War. And so he was continually engaged in his work. And he was engaged in editing his work, and he was engaged in living his life in some sort of a constructive way. So I always think of old Walt as being a much better model, although he's just not as popular as either Emily or Poe. But I think that what people are attracted to in terms of being writers is that act of creation that's transformative in some way, and so they feel that they would be part of something bigger. And I think that is as good a reason as any for writing. I think, when you're taking an anthropology class, they talk about the 3 reasons that cultures across the board have been involved in some kind of religion. The first being that we're lonely in the universe. We want someone to talk to. The second being we want to explain what happens when we die. And the third being that the leaders of the tribe want to control everybody else. And I think of those as being interesting reasons that people become artists or writers as well. We're lonely, and we feel we have something important to say. We would like to believe that we're going to live forever in some way. And the 3 ways of living forever are: you could actually be someone who believes you're going to live forever. You could have children, and you could create something that makes you immortal. So Mozart is not dead, because we all know who he is and recognize his work. Not sure if part of the reason we write is because the leaders of the tribe want to control us, but I do think that creative work is one of those things that makes us immortal. I definitely think that I write partly because there's a conversation I'm having with the universe, and partly because I feel less alone when I'm part of a creative tribe. So the story behind Rio being written, I think would be encouraging to anybody who doesn't consider themselves an expert in whatever they would like to be an expert in. So I will tell you this story. I had been writing poetry for quite a few years, and I was in a group of writers and musicians, mostly because all of our kids were hanging out together. And there were a number of composers in this group and filmmakers. And so a couple of composers were interested in writing an opera. And so one of them talked with me and said he was a big fan of my work and of my poetry, and he wanted to know if I would write an opera, and could we get together and talk about it. So there was a dinner at a Mexican restaurant. A lot of margaritas went down. And my husband and I were there, and Don Davis, who had just come off composing the music to the Matrix movies at that time, was there with his wife. And he asked if I could get an opera, a libretto written in the next 4 months or so, and he would like it to be in Spanish. And he outlined basically what he would like it to be about. And it was like March at this time. So I said I could certainly have it written by the end of the summer at the dinner. And I said I absolutely would commit to that, and I would start sending him drafts within a few weeks. And so he was very excited, and we left, and there was a kind of silence in the car as we were driving home. And finally my husband said, I hadn't realized opera was an interest of yours, honey. And I said, actually, I hadn't realized that either. And he said, well, have you ever been to the opera? And I said, actually not so much, no. And he said, well, we've got a huge music library, but I don't think any of it is opera. And I said, oh, I'm sure we've got some Maria Callas in there somewhere. And he said, and then you said it would be in Spanish. And I said, let's not even worry about that part. Let's just work on the opera part. So we started going to the opera. We started listening to opera 24/7. You came to our house, opera was playing. I listened to it in the car. I listened to it in the shower. I listened to it when I'm driving, when I'm sleeping. We had that opera going, just one after another. We'd listen to Wozzeck, we'd listen to Lulu, we'd listen to bad operas and good operas. We'd listen to different versions of the same opera that people would tell us to listen to. We just did nothing but listen to opera and talk about opera and figure out opera. I do speak Spanish, but I could see that writing an opera in Spanish was going to be too much for me. So I found a woman who was willing to translate it. Her name's Alicia Partnoy, and she had been one of the disappeared in Argentina. So she very much liked the subject matter. She was very excited about it. So I dived in and started sketching this out. Now, I had written plays, I have to say, and so I looked at a bunch of librettos and could see right away that there was definitely a crossover between plays and librettos. It's just that when you're writing a libretto, first of all, each version you have to show to the composer, and they keep asking you to change things. And the other thing is, it is very much like a play, but it's like a play with much more drama and much more heightened language. and it is in many ways much less realistic than most plays. So I definitely think that if there's an art form that you really want to try, you can dive in and get wet and start trying it. And it was a wonderful experience, and obviously after that, I started working on more librettos. I remember, I didn't, again, even know very much about the opera world, so within a couple years, I was at the New York City Opera speaking on opera, and Russell Banks was there, and Mark Adamo, who's a composer, and there were a number of New York opera people there. And I was sitting with Russell and like 10 people on this stage, and we're speaking, and I said to him, I think everybody here except for you and me is gay. And it was the first time I had really realized that the whole opera world in New York was gay. Everyone was better dressed than we were. And Russell said, I know, and I'm starting to wonder about you. So it was just this great experience of meeting all these crazy, flamboyant people and learning about this whole other experience. So I liked it. It was an extremely exciting time. I wanted to just say that from there, the bigger question, I think, is why one starts writing in the first place when one's a writer. I think that when I was in graduate school, I remember saying that I wanted to try different genres. I said I want to write poetry and I want to write prose. And my thesis advisor said, you need to choose a genre and you need to stay with it. And I said, well, Margaret Atwood writes poetry and short stories and novels. And he said, do you think you're Margaret Atwood? And I said, no, I think I'm Kate Gale, and that might be more fantastic. And needless to say, he was not amused. And told me that if I was going to graduate, I had to pick a genre. But I don't think people necessarily do now. Perhaps for your thesis you have to pick a genre, but I think many more people write in more than one genre now. And many poets write either plays or librettos. But I think the bigger question, which I'm coming back to, is why we write in the first place. And so I've talked about this idea that we write to be immortal, but I think that the bigger question is just what makes anybody decide to engage in the creative act. Because the fact is that I think everything is against your writing. I think that for most writers, if you went home to your family and you said, I've decided not to write anymore, and all the time that I have been spending writing, I'm going to spend it with you guys. I'm going to play more softball with you. I'm going to cook for you more. I'm going to garden more with you. I'm going to fly kites more with you. I'm just going to spend more time with you guys instead of writing. Most people's families would be like, that's great. Thank God you gave that up, because just having you in that room by yourself 10, 20 hours a week was really getting on our nerves. So the question is why you would do this anyway. It isn't like exercising. I ran a marathon 10 days ago. And the thing about running is that it has its own reward. Not only can you brag to people in Arkansas that you ran a marathon, which of course is wonderful enough, but even when you're out there running, you kind of feel this sense of peace, accomplishment. It gives you time to think. I mean, there's all these kinds of endorphins going on. But when you're writing, after you're finished writing, often, you leave most of the time when you're in the middle of something. Let's face it, almost all the time when you're writing, you leave and you're not finished. And in fact, you're not really sure what happens next most of the time. And you're not sure if you can write anything good after that. So basically, you leave there grouchy. So why would you go into a small room by yourself to do something nobody cares whether you do or not, that you're probably not going to make very much money, that makes you grouchy? I think that's a question that writers ask themselves all the time. And I'll tell you my answer. And it's a bit of a story. When I was 3, my mother joined a cult in southern New Hampshire. And so I like all the pictures of Maine because I've been to that part of Maine where all those pictures are taken. She and my father got divorced, and she joined this cult. And the idea at this cult was that everybody gave their children, their possessions, and everything they had to the cult leader. And it was a very right-wing Christian cult. And so the parents lived separately from the kids, and they would see them once in a while. I was telling John that my mother played the piano, but I remember when I saw her on occasion that she played the piano. But I basically saw her once a year when I was small, and then after that you didn't see your parents anymore. And we were a couple miles away in a boarding school. And in the boarding school, we were sleeping on the floors in sleeping bags and working most of the time. And for education, we were mostly reading the Bible and listening to Handel's Messiah. I remember one time someone tried to listen to Stravinsky and got quite a beating, because Stravinsky was just not allowed, right? You're supposed to be listening to Handel's Messiah. Occasionally, we listened to Elijah, Mendelssohn's Elijah. That was considered a little bit of a treat there. So we basically are just reading the Bible, listening to Handel's Messiah, and practicing choral practice around the piano. So a great deal of singing. I don't know what this was supposed to do for us. And of course, praying. And so you have 20 kids, 20 girls in a room at night, every night, lying in their sleeping bags. And as they go to sleep, they do what anthropologists would call orphan rock. So you hear this low keening of some kids are actually crying and some kids are just moaning, and they're rocking back and forth trying to kind of put themselves to sleep, because everyone's like 3, 4, 5, 6 when I first get there. So I remember this for the first year or two, and so I must have been like 6 because I was in first grade before I first remember, hearing this crying that would go on for a while at night. And I sat up in my bed and I said, "Who wants to hear a story?" And of course, you're not allowed to talk after lights out, so there's kind of a silence. No one wants to say yes, but the room kind of quiets down, and I start telling them stories. And the stories are basically of this dirty princess. I was quite a dirty girl, didn't like to bathe. The dirty princess lived in a castle with her dirty friends, and there were always bad guys who had the names of whoever our counselors were. So there's Joyce and Tom and so on, were the bad kings and queens that we would behead, we would throw into rivers, we would tie them to the backs of horses and let them run. But we were always in charge by the end of the story. And so these stories went on for years. I didn't leave till I was 18. I finally ran away at 18. My mother and sister, by the way, are still living there, and the school and farm was eventually had to move to Canada because it was repeated investigations of child abuse. They're sort of big on whooping kids. However, to be fair to them, I must say that my sister, who was there also, never did get whooped. By whooped, I mean obviously fairly severe beatings, because she didn't misbehave. But you can imagine yours truly thinking of all kinds of things to do. So it stuck in my head at that point that stories not only kept me alive, because I'm telling these stories, but that it kept the whole group alive. That there was something about the collective consciousness of being inside this story that everybody just sort of quieted down, and so it got, everybody's just waiting for these stories, and so all day I'm trying to think up what the next story is going to be. And so by the time I left there, I was just a storyteller in my head. We were also, I would write down stories often while I was there to sort of take notes, but you weren't allowed to be keeping a journal. So when I finished a journal that I would sort of secretly carry around, I would bury it in the woods. And so for 2 years after I left, I still carried around journals, filled them out, and buried them in the woods. And I still like this idea very much, because I think that writers get into their heads that whatever they write is extremely precious, and that it's so worthy of being sent out and being published and being put into print. But I think a lot of what we're writing is just practicing. It's just us thinking on paper. I mean, if you think about football players and how much time they spend just running into things as practice, how much time, ballet dancers spend stretching and dancing, that they're not on stage and nobody's watching. I don't see why writers don't do more of that. So I spent years burying my work and taking buses around the country, and then decided maybe I would go to college. And primarily, originally because I wanted to learn Spanish, because I somehow pictured myself being a traveling fruit picker. This was my big dream, was to go around picking fruit. I liked fruit. I figured I just needed to learn Spanish, and I could do that. And I also was quite aware that when I left there, since I had no Social Security card and no skills particularly, that I wasn't particularly employable. So I started college thinking I would be a traveling fruit picker. I declared my major as Spanish, and after a year, I was enamored with all my English classes, and I thought, maybe I'll be a writer. And then all those stories that I've been telling and thinking up all these years will come to something. So part of the reason for me that I still write stories is to save myself, so that I'm not lonely, so that I feel that I'm connected to other people. And so I feel that in a way that nothing's changed from that first reason for storytelling in that dark room, to sort of save that group from sadness or loneliness. And I think that stories are part of what transforms us, because in those stories we became people that could rule the universe, could do anything. And I think that's still what happens to us when we read books and when we tell stories. We become this different person. Questions?